September 18, 1940. Berlin, Reich Chancellery, Nazi Germany. Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing the daily propaganda summary with growing frustration. His ministry had produced brilliant newsreels showing German victories in France, powerful radio broadcasts proclaiming the Reich's invincibility, and carefully staged photographs of jubilant soldiers marching through conquered cities. Yet British civilian morale, which should have collapsed under the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, remained inexplicably resilient. His diary entry from that evening read, "The British refuse to acknowledge reality. Our military superiority is absolute, our victory inevitable. Yet Churchill's propaganda machine convinces them to continue this futile resistance. We must break their will. Truth is on our side, we need only communicate it effectively." In 12 hours, the BBC would broadcast another of Churchill's speeches, words that would steel British resolve, mock German pretensions, and demonstrate that in the propaganda war, truth was less important than the story people chose to believe. The propaganda war between Nazi Germany and Britain was fought with words, images, and carefully constructed narratives designed to shape reality itself. Both sides understood that modern warfare required not just military victory, but psychological dominance, convincing their own populations to endure hardship, persuading neutral nations to support their cause, and demoralizing enemy civilians until they demanded surrender. The weapons were radio broadcasts, newsreels, posters, leaflets, and speeches, delivered by masters of mass communication who understood that perception often mattered more than fact. Hitler and Goebbels had pioneered totalitarian propaganda, using state control of media to create a seamless narrative of German racial superiority and inevitable victory. Churchill and Britain's propaganda apparatus responded with a different approach, acknowledging hardship honestly while framing the conflict as civilization's fight against barbarism. The battle for minds would prove as important as the battle for territory. Populations that believed victory was possible would endure bombing, rationing, and casualties. Populations that lost faith would demand negotiation, regardless of military situation. The propaganda war would help determine which nation could sustain the will to fight when victory seemed impossible. The Nazi propaganda machine, Joseph Goebbels, became Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March 1933, immediately after Hitler's seizure of power. His ministry controlled every aspect of German cultural and informational life: newspapers, radio, film, theatre, music, literature, and visual arts. Nothing could be published, broadcast, or performed in Germany without approval from Goebbels's censors. The control was comprehensive and sophisticated. Goebbels understood that effective propaganda required not just censorship, but active creation of compelling narratives. He established the Reich Chamber of Culture, mandatory membership for anyone working in media or arts, with the power to exclude Jews, political opponents, or anyone whose work didn't serve Nazi ideology. The chamber had 7 departments: press, radio, film, theatre, music, literature, and fine arts. Each department vetted members, approved works for publication or performance, and enforced ideological conformity. Journalists who wanted to work had to join the Reich Press Chamber and follow guidelines dictated by Goebbels's ministry. Film directors needed approval from the Reich Film Chamber before receiving funding or distribution. The system produced propaganda of remarkable technical quality. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, documenting the 1934 Nuremberg Rally, pioneered propaganda filmmaking with innovative camera work, dramatic editing, and powerful imagery that portrayed Nazism as a mass movement of historical inevitability. The film employed 30 cameras, 120 crew members, and used techniques including aerial photography, tracking shots, and dramatic low-angle shots that made Hitler appear larger than life. The film's opening sequence, Hitler's aircraft descending through clouds over Nuremberg, was carefully staged to suggest a god descending from heaven. The massive rally sequences, showing hundreds of thousands of uniformly dressed party members, created impressions of unity, power, and historical momentum. The film was brilliant cinematography serving evil purposes. Riefenstahl's 1938 film Olympia, documenting the 1936 Berlin Olympics, similarly advanced propaganda filmmaking. The film pioneered techniques including underwater photography, slow-motion sequences, and dramatic editing that emphasized athletic beauty and German organizational superiority. The opening sequence, showing Greek statues dissolving into modern German athletes, suggested continuity between classical civilization and Nazi Germany. German newsreels, Die Deutsche Wochenschau, were shown before every film in German cinemas, mandatory viewing for millions. The newsreels were produced twice weekly, distributed to over 7,000 cinemas across Germany and occupied territories. By 1943, weekly audiences exceeded 20 million people. The newsreels portrayed German military victories with stirring music, dramatic narration, and carefully edited footage that emphasized German strength while minimizing losses. The Wochenschau from June 1940, showing German troops marching through Paris, was masterful propaganda, portraying the conquest as inevitable, righteous, and achieved with minimal German casualties. The footage showed jubilant German soldiers defeated French troops and suggested that France had welcomed German occupation as liberation from incompetent leadership. Radio was Goebbels' most powerful weapon for reaching mass audiences. By 1939, Germany had the world's highest radio ownership rate. Over 70% of households owned receivers, approximately 16 million radios in a nation of 80 million people. The government had subsidized production of cheap radios specifically to ensure maximum propaganda reach. The Volksempfänger, People's Receiver, cost 35 Reichsmarks, roughly equivalent to 1 week's wages for an average worker. The radio was mass-produced to simple specifications. It could receive German broadcasts clearly, but struggled to pick up foreign stations due to limited range and poor reception of distant signals. The design was deliberate, making it easy to hear German propaganda while difficult to access foreign broadcasts that might contradict official narratives. German radio programming mixed entertainment with propaganda so seamlessly that audiences absorbed ideological messages while enjoying music, drama, and comedy. Entertainment programs included patriotic songs celebrating German victories, historical dramas emphasizing German greatness throughout history, and variety shows that maintained morale while subtly reinforcing Nazi ideology. News broadcasts were carefully scripted to frame every development favorably. Military setbacks were minimized or reinterpreted as tactical repositioning. The retreat from Moscow in winter 1941 was described as elastic defense and strategic withdrawal to prepared positions. German casualties were understated. Official announcements often claimed German losses were 1/10 of actual figures. Enemy losses were exaggerated. Soviet casualties were routinely claimed to be 10 times German losses, regardless of actual figures. The overall narrative was rigidly consistent. Germany was winning, victory was inevitable, the Führer's leadership was infallible, and any setbacks were temporary complications in Germany's march to continental domination. Goebbels' propaganda strategy rested on several core principles that he articulated in his writings and speeches. Constant repetition of simple messages rather than complex arguments, emotional appeals rather than rational discourse, identification of external enemies to blame for any problems, projection of absolute confidence even when reality suggested doubt, and creation of alternate reality through information control. His most famous quote captured his cynical philosophy. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent. For the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. The statement was remarkably candid about propaganda's nature, creating false reality through repetition and information control. Goebbels understood that propaganda worked not because people were stupid, but because they wanted to believe their sacrifices served a greater purpose, that their leaders were strong and wise, that their nation would triumph. Propaganda that reinforced these psychological needs was more effective than complex truth that suggested doubt or failure. The British response. Ministry of Information. Britain's propaganda effort was initially disorganized and ineffective. The Ministry of Information was created in September 1939 under Lord Macmillan, a distinguished jurist who had no experience with mass media or propaganda. The ministry struggled with bureaucratic confusion, unclear objectives, and leadership that didn't understand modern propaganda techniques. Early British propaganda was heavy-handed, condescending, and counterproductive. Initial poster campaigns were disasters that revealed how poorly British authorities understood their own population's psychology. The infamous "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory" poster was meant to inspire national unity but was perceived as patronizing class-based messaging. The US versus you phrasing suggested that politicians and elites would take credit for ordinary people's sacrifices. The poster became object of mockery, appearing in satirical cartoons showing wealthy people relaxing while workers suffered. It was quickly withdrawn after becoming propaganda liability. Another early poster, "Freedom is in peril, defend it with all your might," was criticized for being too vague and abstract. What exactly was freedom, and how should ordinary citizens defend it? The poster provided no concrete guidance and seemed to be empty rhetoric rather than useful information. British censorship was inconsistent and often counterproductive. The government tried to suppress information about bombing damage, believing it would harm morale and provide intelligence to Germany. But people could see the destroyed buildings themselves. They walked past rubble, knew neighbors who'd been killed, experienced disruption to daily life. Official silence about obvious facts just made government information seem untrustworthy. The censorship extended to casualty figures, military setbacks, and economic difficulties. The government believed that admitting problems would demoralize the population. But the policy backfired. People knew things were difficult and resented being treated like children who couldn't handle truth. The transformation came partly through Churchill's leadership and partly through learning from mistakes. Brendan Bracken replaced Lord Macmillan as Minister of Information in July 1941, bringing more sophisticated understanding of media and propaganda. Bracken understood that credibility required honesty about difficulties while maintaining confidence about ultimate outcome. Churchill understood instinctively what Goebbels had learned through study. Effective propaganda required emotional resonance, not just factual accuracy. His speeches became Britain's most effective propaganda weapon, not because they misrepresented reality, but because they framed hardship as heroic endurance and temporary setback as prelude to ultimate triumph. The BBC became crucial to British propaganda strategy, but in a fundamentally different way than German radio served Nazi purposes. The BBC maintained editorial independence from government in ways German radio never did. The corporation was funded by license fees rather than direct government appropriation, and its charter protected editorial independence even during wartime. BBC News broadcasts reported setbacks honestly. The evacuation from Dunkirk, portrayed as military defeat despite successful evacuation, bombing casualties reported accurately, shipping losses in the Atlantic acknowledged rather than minimized. This honesty created credibility that German propaganda lacked. When BBC reported victories, audiences believed them because BBC had proven willing to report bad news. British propagandists discovered through trial and error that acknowledging difficulty while expressing confidence in ultimate victory was more effective than denying problems existed. Churchill's speeches exemplified this approach. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Acknowledged the hardship ahead, while we shall never surrender, expressed absolute determination to prevail." The Ministry of Information eventually developed sophisticated operations across multiple domains. Film units produced documentaries like London Can Take It, Target for Tonight, and Desert Victory, showing British forces and civilians honestly while emphasizing courage and effectiveness. The films were shown in British cinemas and distributed internationally, especially to American audiences. Print propaganda improved dramatically after early failures. Later posters used simple, direct messaging that resonated with British sensibilities. "Keep calm and carry on," though ironically this famous poster was never actually distributed during the war, being held in reserve for invasion. "Careless talk costs lives," and "dig for victory," encouraging home food production. The propaganda emphasized themes that resonated with democratic audiences. Individual freedom versus totalitarian oppression, law and civilization versus barbarism, defending home and family rather than conquering others. These themes were harder to convey in visually dramatic terms than Nazi pageantry, but they aligned with British values and proved sustainable through years of hardship. The Battle of France, competing narratives. The fall of France in June 1940 presented both sides with propaganda challenges and opportunities. For Germany, the victory validated years of propaganda claiming German military superiority and racial supremacy over decadent democracies. Goebbels' ministry produced triumphant newsreels, organized victory celebrations, and created narratives portraying the conquest as inevitable result of German organizational genius and French weakness. The most powerful German propaganda image was Hitler visiting Paris on June 23, 1940, just days after France's surrender. Photographs showed the Führer at the Eiffel Tower, Trocadero, Arc de Triomphe, Opéra Garnier, and Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides. The images were carefully staged with Hitler accompanied by architect Albert Speer and sculptor Arno Breker, suggesting Hitler as artist and visionary rather than mere military conqueror. The photographs of Hitler at Napoleon's tomb were particularly significant propaganda, suggesting Hitler as Napoleon's successor, conquering France just as Napoleon had conquered Europe. The imagery implied that Hitler had achieved what Napoleon accomplished, validating Nazi claims about historical destiny and German superiority. The images were distributed worldwide through wire services, newspapers, and newsreels. German propaganda intended them to demonstrate German invincibility and demoralize remaining enemies. The psychological message was clear: Germany had defeated France in 6 weeks. Britain would be next. Resistance was futile. Goebbels' diary from June 24, 1940. The Führer's visit to Paris creates magnificent propaganda opportunity. The photographs show him as master of Europe's greatest city, following in Napoleon's footsteps but succeeding where Napoleon ultimately failed. The psychological impact will be enormous. The French will accept their defeat as historically inevitable. The British will recognize that resistance is futile. Neutral nations will accommodate German power rather than opposing it. We are winning not just militarily, but psychologically. The battle of ideas is as important as battle of arms, and we are winning both. For Britain, France's fall was a propaganda catastrophe that required immediate creative response. The natural narrative, Britain now stood alone against victorious Germany that had conquered all of Western Europe, was potentially demoralizing. British strategists worried that public morale would collapse when people realized Britain faced Germany without significant allies. Churchill transformed potential despair into defiant pride through his June 18th speech to the House of Commons, broadcast nationally that evening. The speech reframed defeat as transition to new phase rather than catastrophic collapse. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. The phrasing was crucial. Britain wasn't defeated, it was moving to the next battle. The war hadn't been lost. It had entered a new phase where British strengths would be more relevant than French weaknesses. Standing alone wasn't isolation. It was independence from unreliable allies who'd proven unable to resist German power. Churchill continued, "Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war." The rhetoric elevated the coming battle from military engagement to civilizational struggle. Britain wasn't just defending territory, it was defending Western civilization itself against barbarism. The framing gave the struggle transcendent meaning that justified extraordinary sacrifice. The speech's peroration became one of history's most famous passages. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." The rhetoric was magnificent, casting potential defeat as opportunity for historical greatness. If Britain was going to lose, it would lose heroically, and future generations would remember British courage even in defeat. But the speech also suggested that victory remained possible if British people showed sufficient determination. The propaganda battle over France's fall demonstrated fundamentally different approaches to mass communication. German propaganda emphasized strength, inevitability, and enemy weakness, telling audiences what they wanted to hear about easy victory. British propaganda acknowledged difficulty while emphasizing moral superiority and unbreakable will, telling harder truths about the fight ahead while insisting it was worth continuing. The Blitz. Propaganda under fire. The German bombing campaign against British cities from September 1940 through May 1941 created the most intense propaganda battle of the war. Both sides used the bombing to support competing narratives about the war's nature and likely outcome. Goebbels portrayed the bombing as righteous punishment for British refusal to accept German victory and continued aggression against Germany. German newsreels showed Luftwaffe bombers taking off at dusk, dramatic footage of bombs falling from bomb bay doors, and explosions lighting up British cities at night. The narration emphasized German air superiority and suggested Britain faced inevitable destruction unless it surrendered immediately. German propaganda broadcasts to Britain emphasized the bombing's destructiveness and futility of continued resistance. Hans Fritzsche, head of German radio's news service, broadcast nightly commentaries describing bombing damage and suggesting British government was lying about casualties and maintaining hopeless war. William Joyce, Lord Haw-Haw, broadcast nightly from Hamburg, describing bombing damage in specific British cities with details meant to suggest German intelligence knew everything happening in Britain. He would name streets that had been hit, describe damage to specific buildings, and claim knowledge of casualty figures the British government was suppressing. Joyce's broadcasts followed a consistent pattern, opening with his signature Germany calling, in an exaggerated upper-class accent, reporting supposed facts about British conditions and German military superiority, predicting imminent British collapse, and suggesting that British leadership was incompetent and lying to the population about true situation. The broadcasts were designed to create fear, undermine confidence in British leadership, and suggest that resistance was futile. Joyce would report ships sunk by U-boats, name British pilots shot down, describe destroyed factories, and claim German forces were preparing for invasion that British defences couldn't prevent. But Joyce's effectiveness was limited by several factors that German propagandists didn't fully understand. His obvious propaganda purpose made audiences skeptical. Everyone knew he was German agent, so his claims were automatically suspect. His exaggerations were easily detected when he claimed damage in towns that had suffered only minor hits, or named ships that hadn't been sunk. His upper-class accent, meant to sound authoritative, increasingly sounded affected and ridiculous to British working-class audiences. Most importantly, British audiences could compare his claims against their own experiences. When Joyce said a city had been destroyed, but listeners from that city knew damage was limited, his credibility collapsed. When he predicted imminent invasion that didn't materialize, his predictions lost power. British propaganda faced a difficult challenge: acknowledge the bombing's destructiveness honestly while maintaining morale and projecting continued resistance. The solution was to frame the bombing as test of national character that Britain was passing heroically. Newsreels and documentaries showed bomb damage but emphasized civilian courage and rapid recovery. Fires were fought and extinguished. Rubble was cleared by morning. Transportation was restored within hours. Businesses reopened. Normal life continued. The message was clear: Britain could absorb whatever Germany delivered and continue fighting. The documentary London Can Take It, released in October 1940, exemplified British propaganda strategy during the Blitz. Directed by Humphrey Jennings and Harry Watt, narrated by American journalist Quentin Reynolds, the 9-minute film showed dramatic bomb damage, destroyed buildings, crater-filled streets, fires burning across London's skyline. But the narration emphasized resilience and determination. I am speaking from London. It is late afternoon, and the people of London are preparing for the night. Mighty ordeal lies ahead. This ordeal they must face. Bombs by the ton will fall on this city before dawn comes again. The film showed air raid sirens, people entering shelters, anti-aircraft guns firing, bombs exploding. But it also showed morning aftermath, people emerging from shelters, going to work, clearing rubble, conducting normal business despite destruction around them. Reynolds' narration concluded, "London can take it, and London can hand it out too, as the Nazis will find out before this thing is over." The film acknowledged suffering, while insisting Britain remained defiant and capable of striking back. The film was shown in American cinemas with enormous impact on US public opinion. American audiences saw British civilians enduring nightly bombing with courage and determination, continuing normal activities despite danger. The propaganda effect was to shift American opinion toward supporting Britain. These weren't weak people needing rescue, but brave allies worth helping. Churchill's speeches during the Blitz became legendary for their defiant tone and memorable phrasing that captured British determination. His October 8, 1940 broadcast addressed German bombing directly. These cruel, wanton, indiscriminate bombings of London are, of course, a part of Hitler's invasion plans. He hopes, by killing large numbers of civilians and women and children, that he will terrorize and cow the people of this mighty imperial city and make them a burden and an anxiety to the government, and thus distract our attention unduly from the ferocious onslaught he is preparing. Little does he know the spirit of the British nation or the tough fibre of the Londoners, whose forebears played a leading part in the establishment of parliamentary institutions and who have been bred to value freedom far above their lives. The speech reframed German strategy as failed terror bombing rather than effective military operation. It portrayed British civilians not as victims, but as heroes resisting barbarism. It connected contemporary courage to British historical traditions of defending liberty. Churchill continued, "This wicked man, the repository and embodiment of many forms of soul-destroying hatred, this monstrous product of former wrongs and shame, has now resolved to try to break our famous island race by a process of indiscriminate slaughter and destruction. What he has done is to kindle a fire in British hearts, here and all over the world, which will glow long after all traces of the conflagration he has caused in London have been removed. The rhetoric transformed destruction into moral victory. German bombing wasn't defeating Britain, it was strengthening British resolve and generating sympathy from neutral nations." Churchill concluded by expressing absolute confidence that Britain would prevail. "We will mete out to the Germans the measure, and more than the measure, that they have meted out to us." The propaganda battle over the Blitz revealed fundamental differences in approach. German propaganda emphasized power and threatened more destruction if resistance continued. A strategy of intimidation through demonstration of superior force. British propaganda acknowledged suffering but framed it as test of national character that Britain was passing with distinction. A strategy of resilience through moral superiority. German propaganda tried to break British will through fear. British propaganda strengthened will through pride in collective endurance. The British approach proved more effective. Morale remained high throughout the Blitz. Production continued despite disruption. And German bombing ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objective of forcing British surrender. Radio wars, the BBC versus German broadcasting. The battle for radio audiences was central to both sides' propaganda strategies. Radio reached millions simultaneously, could operate continuously day and night, and created intimate connection between speaker and listener that print media couldn't match. The BBC's European service broadcast in multiple languages to occupied countries and neutral nations. By 1943, the BBC broadcast in over 40 languages, including German, French, Dutch, Norwegian, Danish, Polish, Czech, Italian, and numerous others. The broadcasts included news, commentary, entertainment, and coded messages to resistance movements. BBC credibility came from relative honesty about military developments. The broadcasts acknowledged defeats as well as victories, building trust that German radio lacked. This credibility made BBC's victory claims believable when German propaganda's constant optimism had destroyed its own credibility. BBC News broadcasts during 1940 and 1941 reported British setbacks honestly. The Norway campaign failure in April 1940, evacuation from France in June, bombing casualties throughout the Blitz, shipping losses in the Atlantic battle. The honesty was sometimes uncomfortable for British government. Officials wanted to suppress bad news, but BBC maintained that long-term credibility required honest reporting. When the BBC reported victories, the Battle of Britain in autumn 1940, successes against Italian forces in North Africa, sinking of the Bismarck in May 1941, Audiences believed them because BBC had proven willing to report bad news. The credibility advantage was enormous. BBC could claim successes and be believed, while German propaganda claimed successes and was suspected of lying. The BBC also broadcast entertainment that served propaganda purposes while maintaining audiences through actual entertainment value. Music programs featured songs celebrating British resistance and mocking Hitler. "We're going to hang out the washing on the Siegfried Line," and "Hitler has only got one ball" were popular ditties that combined humour with defiance. Comedy programs ridiculed Nazi pretensions while maintaining morale through humour. "It's That Man Again, It May" was an enormously popular comedy show that satirized bureaucracy, rationing, and wartime inconveniences, while occasionally mocking Hitler and Nazi ideology. The program demonstrated that Britain maintained sense of humour despite hardship, itself a propaganda message about British resilience. Drama programs portrayed ordinary people showing courage under hardship: firefighters during the Blitz, soldiers in combat, families maintaining normal life despite disruption. The programs provided entertainment while reinforcing propaganda messages about British character and determination. The German Broadcasting Corporation, Reichsrundfunk Gesellschaft, broadcast to Britain in English through numerous programs attempting to demoralize British audiences and discourage American support. The broadcasts emphasized German military superiority, British government incompetence, futility of continued resistance, and inevitability of German victory. William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw, became the most famous German propaganda broadcaster to Britain, achieving such notoriety that his nickname became part of British popular culture. Joyce was British-born, raised in Ireland, had been member of British Union of Fascists under Oswald Mosley, and fled to Germany in August 1939 to avoid prosecution for his fascist activities. His broadcasts began Germany calling," in an exaggerated upper-class accent that made him instantly recognizable and eventually made him target of mockery. The nickname Lord Haw Haw was coined by Daily Express journalist Jonah Barrington, referring to Joyce's affected aristocratic pronunciation. Joyce's propaganda strategy was to sound well-informed about British conditions while predicting doom. He would report specific bombing damage, naming streets and buildings that had been hit, describing casualties, suggesting British government was suppressing true extent of damage. He would name ships sunk by U-boats, providing details meant to suggest German intelligence had penetrated British defences completely. But Joyce's effectiveness was limited by several factors British propagandists eventually understood and exploited. His obvious propaganda purpose made audiences skeptical. Everyone knew he was German agent speaking from Berlin, so automatic skepticism greeted his claims. His exaggerations were easily detected when he claimed catastrophic damage in towns that had suffered only minor hits. His predictions of imminent invasion and British collapse repeatedly failed to materialize, undermining his credibility. Most importantly, his upper-class accent, which Goebbels thought would make him sound authoritative to British audiences, increasingly sounded affected and ridiculous, especially to working-class listeners who resented upper-class pretensions. Joyce became figure of mockery rather than fear. British comedians imitated his Germany calling opening. Music hall performers mocked his accent, and ordinary people made jokes about his predictions. British audiences listened to Lord Haw Haw partly for entertainment, laughing at his bombastic style and obvious lies. The government initially tried to discourage listening, worrying that Joyce was undermining morale. But monitoring eventually revealed Joyce was counterproductive to German propaganda goals. He was too obviously a propagandist to be credible, and his failures to predict events correctly made German propaganda generally less believable. BBC broadcasts to Germany and occupied Europe were more effective than German broadcasts to Britain, primarily because BBC credibility advantage was decisive. The BBC broadcast in German from 1938 onward, providing news that German populations couldn't access through Nazi-controlled media. The broadcasts provided information about actual military situation, reported Allied victories honestly, acknowledged German military successes when they occurred, and generally maintained factual accuracy that contrasted sharply with obvious propaganda from German official sources. German authorities made listening to foreign broadcasts illegal under August 1939 decree, with penalties including imprisonment and, in extreme cases, death. The prohibition itself suggested Nazi fear of BBC effectiveness. If German propaganda was truthful and compelling, foreign broadcasts wouldn't threaten it. The fact that listening was criminalized indicated that Nazi authorities knew their propaganda was vulnerable to contradiction from sources Germans might find more credible than official channels. Despite penalties, listening to BBC German-language broadcasts was common throughout Germany, especially among educated middle-class Germans who were skeptical of Nazi propaganda. Churchill's speeches. Rhetoric as weapon. Winston Churchill's wartime speeches became Britain's most effective propaganda weapon, not through deception, but through rhetoric that acknowledged reality while framing it in terms that inspired continued resistance and justified continued sacrifice. Churchill's style was distinctively old-fashioned by 1940 standards. Victorian rhetoric, complex sentence structure loaded with subordinate clauses, historical references drawing on thousands of years of Western civilization, and elevated language that would seem pompous from most speakers, but somehow worked when Churchill delivered it. His delivery made the rhetoric effective, his distinctive voice with its slight lisp, dramatic pauses that let phrases sink in, emotional inflection that conveyed absolute conviction in what he was saying, and physical presence that radiated determination even in radio broadcasts where audiences couldn't see him. His speeches mixed acknowledgement of hardship with expressions of defiant confidence in ultimate victory. The June 4, 1940 speech after Dunkirk exemplified this approach, acknowledging military defeat while expressing determination to continue. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The speech acknowledged that German invasion might reach British soil, not typically the message governments wanted to send, since it suggested defensive failure. But the acknowledgement made the defiance more powerful. Even if Germans landed in Britain, even if they captured beaches and fields and towns, resistance would continue in streets and hills until victory or extinction. The uncompromising tone left no room for negotiation or acceptance of defeat. Churchill's rhetoric created memorable phrases that became propaganda slogans, repeated in newspapers, posters, and ordinary conversations. "Their finest hour," referring to Britain's solitary stand against Nazi Germany, "never surrender," expressing absolute determination to continue fighting. "Blood, toil, tears and sweat," acknowledging the suffering ahead. "The few," elevating RAF pilots to heroic status. The phrases were repeated so frequently they became part of how British people understood their situation, providing language that framed hardship as meaningful sacrifice and defeat as temporary setback on path to ultimate victory. His speeches framed the war in historical and moral terms that transcended immediate military situation. the August 20, 1940 speech, delivered to House of Commons after RAF victory in Battle of Britain, elevated RAF pilots to historical heroes. The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase "the few" became instantly famous, providing honorific title for RAF fighter pilots that elevated them to elite status. The rhetoric suggested their battle was historically significant beyond immediate tactical outcome. They were defending civilization itself, and future generations would remember their sacrifice. Churchill's rhetoric also effectively mocked Hitler and Nazism, undermining German propaganda's aura of invincibility through humor and contempt. His September 11, 1940 speech ridiculed Hitler's repeated invasion threats. This wicked man, this monstrous abortion of hatred and defeat, is now resolved to break our famous island race by a process of indiscriminate slaughter and destruction. What he has done is to kindle a fire in British hearts, here and all over the world, which will glow long after all traces of the fires he has caused in London have been removed. He has lighted a fire which will burn with a steady and consuming flame until the last vestiges of Nazi tyranny have been burnt out of Europe. Later in the same speech, Churchill mocked German invasion preparations with characteristic humor. "We are waiting for the long-promised invasion. So are the fishes." The line got enormous laugh from his Commons audience and was widely repeated, deflating German threats while suggesting British confidence that invasion would fail catastrophically. German leadership found Churchill's rhetoric infuriating precisely because it was effective at maintaining British morale despite military setbacks. Hitler called Churchill a criminal lunatic, that drunken warmonger, and the most bloodthirsty amateur strategist in history. The personal attack suggested that Hitler recognized Churchill as formidable opponent in propaganda war. Goebbels's diary entries reveal frustration at Churchill's ability to maintain British morale through rhetoric. Churchill's speeches are masterpieces of psychological manipulation. He admits defeats, but frames them as moral victories. He acknowledges hardship, but portrays it as test of character that British people are passing heroically. He cannot defeat us militarily in current circumstances, but he prevents British people from accepting the inevitable outcome. His rhetoric sustains British will to fight when rational calculation would suggest they should negotiate. This is his great achievement and our great frustration. The assessment was partly correct. Churchill couldn't defeat Germany militarily in 1940, 1941, when Britain fought essentially alone. But his rhetoric helped Britain survive until circumstances changed, until Germany invaded Soviet Union, until America entered the war, until the alliance against Germany became powerful enough to achieve victory. Maintaining will to fight when military victory seemed impossible was itself a strategic achievement of enormous importance. Atrocity, propaganda, truth and exaggeration. Both sides used claims of enemy atrocities to justify their cause and demonize opponents. The propaganda challenge was that both sides actually committed atrocities, but they differed dramatically in scale, systematic nature, and ideological purpose. German propaganda portrayed Britain as fighting to preserve its exploitative empire, built on oppression of subject peoples, deliberately starving populations under British control, and bombing German civilians as deliberate terror policy rather than military necessity. The claims had some factual basis that made them effective propaganda. Britain did have an empire maintained partly through military force and colonial administration that local populations often resented. British naval blockade did cause food shortages in German-occupied Europe, though whether this constituted starvation was debatable. RAF Bomber Command did bomb German cities, causing civilian casualties alongside military-industrial damage. But German propaganda exaggerated and distorted these facts to create narrative of British barbarism. German broadcasts claimed Britain intentionally starved Indian populations to redirect food to British consumption, neglecting to mention that Bengal famine of 1943 was caused by complex factors, including Japanese conquest of Burma, eliminating rice imports, poor monsoon reducing local harvests, and administrative failures rather than deliberate British policy of starvation. German propaganda portrayed RAF bombing as pure terror attacks on civilians with no military purpose, ignoring that Luftwaffe had initiated city bombing with Rotterdam, Warsaw, and London, and neglecting to mention that British bombing targeted industrial facilities, transportation infrastructure, and military installations alongside unavoidable civilian casualties. The propaganda created moral equivalence between German actions and Allied actions, suggesting that both sides were equally brutal and that German aggression was justified response to Allied provocation. This narrative helped sustain German civilian morale by suggesting that Germany was victim rather than aggressor. British propaganda portrayed Germany as barbaric, genocidal, and determined to enslave conquered populations. These claims were substantially accurate, but were initially met with skepticism because they seemed too extreme to be credible, especially given memory of false atrocity propaganda from World War I. Reports of Nazi atrocities against Jews reached Britain from 1940 onward. Mass executions in Poland, establishment of ghettos, deportations to concentration camps, systematic murder. British intelligence received detailed reports from Polish resistance, Jewish refugees, and other sources documenting German crimes. But British propagandists faced a credibility problem inherited from World War I, WWI. British propaganda had included exaggerated atrocity stories, Germans bayoneting Belgian babies, crucifying Canadian soldiers, operating corpse factories, that were later revealed as fabrications or extreme exaggerations. Post-war revelations about WWI propaganda lies had created lasting skepticism about atrocity claims. British audiences in 1940–1941 were understandably skeptical when told that Germans were systematically murdering millions of civilians. The claims seemed like repetition of discredited WWI propaganda, too extreme to be credible, obviously designed to generate hatred of enemy. The British government was cautious about publicizing Nazi atrocities because officials worried the claims would be dismissed as propaganda exaggeration, potentially damaging British credibility on other matters. When information about concentration camps and mass executions reached London, officials debated whether to publicize it. Would people believe such extreme claims, or would they assume it was propaganda lying? Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden commented in 1942, "The difficulty is that these accounts of German atrocities are so horrible that ordinary people simply cannot believe them. They assume we're exaggerating for propaganda purposes, as they know we did during the last war. The truth is actually worse than anything we're saying, but we can't convince people of that." This created a tragic irony. German atrocity propaganda exaggerated relatively minor legitimate Allied actions and created false moral equivalence, while British atrocity propaganda understated massive German crimes because the truth seemed too extreme to be credible. The full scope of Nazi genocide wasn't widely publicized until late in the war, when Allied armies liberated concentration camps and evidence became overwhelming. Photographs and film footage from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Buchenwald in 1945 finally convinced skeptics that reports of Nazi atrocities hadn't been exaggerated propaganda. If anything, they'd been understatements of horrors almost beyond human comprehension. Propaganda to America. The battle for neutral opinion. Both Germany and Britain conducted extensive propaganda operations targeting American public opinion, understanding that US material support and potential military intervention would be decisive factors in determining war's outcome. German propaganda to America emphasized several themes designed to exploit American isolationist sentiment. The war was European affair that didn't concern America and didn't threaten American interests. Britain was fighting to preserve its exploitative empire rather than defending democracy. American entry would lead to massive casualties without strategic benefit to US, and powerful Jewish interests were manipulating American policy to serve their own purposes rather than genuine American interests. The German Library of Information in New York distributed pro-German literature, arranged speaking tours for American isolationists sympathetic to Germany, and funded organizations advocating American neutrality, such as America First Committee. German propaganda exploited legitimate American isolationist sentiment, suggesting that staying out of European wars was traditional American wisdom, dating to Washington's farewell address. German agents cultivated relationships with American isolationists like aviator Charles Lindbergh, who gave speeches and radio addresses arguing against American intervention. Lindbergh's September 1941 speech in Des Moines blamed the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration for pushing America toward war, exemplifying themes German propaganda promoted. The propaganda was effective with significant segments of American opinion through 1940 and much of 1941. Polls showed American public opinion divided on whether to support Britain, with majorities favoring staying out of direct combat involvement, even while approving Lend-Lease aid. British propaganda to America was initially hampered by American skepticism about British motives and memory of WWI propaganda that had manipulated US into entering that conflict. Many Americans suspected Britain wanted to manipulate US into fighting Britain's war to preserve British empire. American isolationists portrayed British propaganda as cynical manipulation of American sentiment for British imperial purposes. British propaganda strategy evolved to emphasize shared democratic values and existential threat that Nazi victory posed to Western civilization, including America. The strategy avoided asking directly for American military intervention, which would trigger isolationist backlash, instead emphasizing Britain's role as democracy's defender and suggesting American interests aligned with British survival. Churchill's speeches were broadcast in America, presenting him as heroic leader defending civilization against barbarism. American radio networks carried his major addresses, exposing millions of Americans to his rhetoric about defending freedom against tyranny. The broadcasts portrayed Britain not as declining imperial power seeking American help, but as democratic nation fighting alone against totalitarian aggression. British propaganda benefited enormously from German actions that validated British claims about Nazi brutality. The Blitz demonstrated German willingness to bomb civilians and suggested what might happen to American cities if Germany dominated Europe. German U-boat attacks on American shipping, including sinking of USS Reuben James in October 1941 before Pearl Harbor, increased American sympathy for Britain and anger at Germany. Reports of Nazi atrocities in occupied Europe supported British portrayal of war as civilization versus barbarism. The documentary London Can Take It was shown in American theaters in autumn 1940, depicting British civilians enduring German bombing with courage. American audiences saw women and children in bomb shelters, firefighters battling blazes, people continuing daily activities despite danger. Narrator Quentin Reynolds was an American journalist whose commentary resonated with American audiences. He presented British resistance as an inspiring example of democratic peoples defending freedom. British propaganda's most effective argument was ultimately the simplest. Britain was fighting to preserve freedom against totalitarian aggression. If Britain fell, America would face Nazi-dominated Europe alone, without allies and with Germany controlling Atlantic Ocean. American security depended on British survival, even if America didn't enter the war directly as combatant. This argument proved increasingly persuasive as German victories continued through 1940, 1941, and Britain's survival seemed uncertain. American public opinion gradually shifted towards supporting Britain through Lend-Lease and other aid short of direct military intervention. By December 1941, polls showed 2/3 of Americans favored helping Britain even at risk of war. Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 ended the debate about American intervention by bringing US into war against Japan and subsequently against Germany. But British propaganda had already succeeded in portraying Britain's cause as America's cause, ensuring American support even before Japan forced America into war as direct combatant. The final accounting, the propaganda war between Nazi Germany and Britain, demonstrates several enduring truths about mass communication, psychological warfare, and relationship between narrative and reality in modern conflict. Propaganda disconnected from reality eventually loses credibility regardless of technical sophistication. German propaganda was technically brilliant. Sophisticated filmmaking using innovative techniques, effective radio production reaching millions, compelling visual imagery in posters and photographs. But it was built on lies that reality eventually exposed. When German propaganda claimed inevitable victory while German armies were retreating and German cities were burning, even technically perfect propaganda couldn't overcome obvious falsehood visible to anyone with eyes. Acknowledgement of hardship combined with credible hope is more effective than denial that problems exist. British propaganda acknowledged setbacks, bombing damage, casualties, and military defeats, but framed them as temporary difficulties on path to ultimate victory. The honesty built credibility that made British victory claims believable when they occurred. German propaganda denied or minimized setbacks, creating impression that official sources couldn't be trusted. Propaganda that aligns with audience values is more sustainable than propaganda demanding acceptance of alien ideology. British propaganda emphasized democracy, individual freedom, rule of law, values British audiences already held. German propaganda to foreign audiences emphasized racial superiority, authoritarian leadership, conquest, values most audiences rejected, making German propaganda inherently limited in international appeal. Controlling information flow is less important than creating believable narratives that people choose to accept. Nazi Germany could prevent competing domestic narratives through censorship and punishment, but couldn't prevent Germans from learning about defeats, experiencing Allied bombing, or accessing foreign broadcasts. Information control only works when audience has no alternative sources. Once alternatives exist, propaganda must compete on credibility, and German propaganda lost that competition. The battle for American opinion demonstrated that propaganda targeting foreign audiences requires understanding their values and concerns. German propaganda to America failed because it was built on Nazi ideology that most Americans rejected. Racial theories, authoritarian government, contempt for democracy. British propaganda succeeded because it emphasized shared democratic values, common threats, and historical connections between English-speaking peoples. Churchill and Goebbels were both masters of mass communication who understood that modern warfare required psychological as well as military victory. Goebbels had more resources, more complete control over information, more sophisticated propaganda machinery. But Churchill had more credible message that sustained British will through years when military victory seemed impossible. In the battle for minds, the story people believe determines their willingness to endure sacrifice. Britain told a story of democratic peoples defending freedom against tyranny, a story its citizens chose to believe despite hardship. Germany told a story of racial superiority and inevitable victory, a story that collapsed when reality contradicted its core claims. The propaganda war demonstrated that controlling the narrative is as important as controlling the battlefield. But narratives only work when they're credible, sustainable, and aligned with values people actually hold. Hitler and Goebbels battled Churchill for the minds of millions. Churchill won not because British propaganda was more technically sophisticated, it wasn't, but because it told a story people could believe even when circumstances were desperate, and that made all the difference. 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 Made all the difference.